Ms. Weiser, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of your written testimony on ballot collection restrictions. I mean, our hearing today is about the District of Columbia, and I don't think it would be a surprise to anybody that North Dakota and D.C. are two very different places. In my home state, sometimes you have to drive several hundred miles to access a post office, but that's not the case in D.C. And your written testimony implies that restrictions on ballot collection disproportionately harm voters in rural areas with post offices in very different things. But again, we're talking about D.C. Do you know how many post offices are located in D.C.?
I do not.
I think it's 60. Do you know how many square miles D.C. is?
I do not.
It's just under 70, 68.3. That would mean that there's essentially a post office every 1.13 square miles in Washington, D.C. And I can talk about the difficulty accessing post offices in rural areas and how to solve that. We've had that discussion in this committee since my entire time being in there. But when we're telling me that there's a problem with ballot collection in the District of Columbia, a city with a post office every 1.13 square miles, it sounds to me like, to my constituents, that's laughable. And I would be really interested in what you would tell me to tell my constituents at home.
Well, thank you. So I was addressing the policy nationally, but in D.C. it is voters with disabilities and elderly voters, even if they have post offices nearby, may need assistance in actually, they might not be able to use the benefit of mail balloting if they lack mobility or and don't have that assistance.
Well, but that's not unique to D.C. We have,
No.
It's everybody. And at least in D.C., you have a post office every 1.13 miles.
That is not unique to D.C., but in most places, actually, ballot assistance is in fact permitted, and members of both political parties engage in it. It is a secure way of providing voters with assistance, especially those voters with disabilities, limited mobility, or voters who are very far from post offices.
All right. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and outside of the policy involved around letting foreign nationals vote, which I find fascinating, I have some questions on what the safeguards exist in that space. I don't know how many foreign nationals are in D.C. at any given time, but I would assume that comparatively, because we are embassies, we're the seat of the government in the United States, that it's significantly higher than the population as a whole. Mr. Cuccinelli, I think you and I would agree that allowing foreign nationals to vote in an election is a bad idea.
True.
But even if you and I agree that that policy is a bad idea, it exists, right?
In
it's about
D.C. and a
implemented,
few
yeah.
other places, yes.
What safeguards are in place to make sure they're not voting at home?
Well, none yet.
Okay, what safeguards should be put in place to make sure? You can come in with a foreign passport and say, I'm going to vote in a D.C. municipal election. I work at the Norwegian, my wife's from Oslo, Norway, a Norwegian embassy. Are we checking with the Norwegian government if they're voting in two elections at once?
No, I don't think we care. Honestly, we might care if the other election was in Maryland or Virginia and D.C.,
well, of course.
But we clearly don't care if it's D.C. and Norway.
I think that, but we should care. Every state with a university deals with these issues. North Dakota has the easiest ballot. We're the only state in the country without voter registration. We have a 30-day residency requirement. You go to school at the University of North Dakota. You go to the school at NDSU. You're from Minnesota. You're from Illinois. You're from Iowa. We want you to be able to vote in North Dakota, provided you're not voting in Iowa. Why aren't we setting up those safeguards here?
That's an excellent question, Congressman. I don't have an answer to that.
I don't know what the closest D.C. election has been in the last 10 years, but I'm assuming there's been something that's been fairly close.
Probably primaries, yes.
Yeah,
And I would note, I'm hearing occasional allegations that are partisan in nature, like the Republicans are trying to change outcomes in D.C. That's not going to happen.
Well, you know who I don't want to change the outcome in any U.S. election? Foreign citizens that are voting at home. Voting is a sacred right. It's a sacred right in North Dakota. It's a sacred right in Minnesota. It's everywhere. But when you're voting in one place, you're not voting in another place. That is how this is supposed to work, particularly in the
That is
the
not a
nation's
requirement in the D.C. non-citizen voting allowance.
Well, outside of being terrible policy, I think the safeguards in place absolutely don't exist. And what you're telling me is that's true.
Correct.
All right, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.